1925, the United States Army War College published what it claimed would be the final word on race and ability. It was a cold academic document, one drenched in racist pseudoscience. Its conclusion was absolute and cruel. According to the report, the Negro was of inferior mentality, possessed a weak character, and was naturally subservient. It declared that black men lacked the intelligence for technical work, the courage for combat, and the leadership for command. To its authors, these lies were not opinions, they were scientific facts. This report became the official justification for a segregated military, a wall of prejudice built on a foundation of falsehoods. But then, you have to ask yourself, how in less than 20 years did the same U.S. military that published such garbage science end up begging for help from the very men it once deemed inferior? How did white bomber crews flying through the deadly skies of Nazi Germany find themselves radioing in desperation, calling for one specific group of fighter pilots to protect them? How did the so-called inferior become the most requested, most respected, and most effective bomber escorts in the entire 15th Air Force? The answer is both heartbreaking and inspiring, because this is the story of two wars fought at once, one against the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs of the Luftwaffe above Europe, and another against the crushing weight of prejudice back home. To win the first war, they had to be good. To win the second, they had to be perfect. This is the story of how the German Luftwaffe learned to fear the very pilots they were taught to dismiss. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, the men who painted the tails of their planes crimson red, and in doing so, rewrote history in a language of fire and steel. Their journey to those blood-red tails didn't begin in a cockpit, it began in a political storm. By the late 1930s, as war loomed over the horizon, civil rights leaders pressed President Roosevelt's administration with a question it could no longer ignore. How could America claim to be a champion of democracy abroad while denying it to 13 million of its own citizens at home? The pressure worked, barely. In 1941, the War Department announced the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit. But they didn't call it a breakthrough in military equality. They called it the Tuskegee Experiment. That word, experiment, was no accident. It was a test, and many in power expected, even hoped, it would fail. The cadets were sent to a segregated, hastily built airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama, commanded by white officers who largely shared the racist beliefs of that 1925 report. The deck was stacked against them from the very beginning, but the architects of this experiment made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the human spirit, because when you subject men to immense pressure, you don't always break them. Sometimes you create diamonds. The training at Tuskegee was brutal, and yet from that fire heroes emerged. It was a crucible, built to burn away every trace of weakness. The cadets knew they weren't just flying for themselves. They were flying for the future of their entire race in the armed forces. One single failure could be used as proof to end the experiment altogether. So they pushed themselves beyond human limits. While white cadets and other programs logged about 200 flight hours, the men at Tuskegee trained for 300. Their washout rate was brutal. 60% failed, compared to 40% in white programs. Their instructors, led by the strict and unyielding Colonel Noel Parrish, demanded near-perfect precision and discipline. He wasn't simply shaping pilots, he was forging a brotherhood of excellence, a living answer to the lies that had held them down for generations. When the first group of graduates, led by the calm and brilliant Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., finally shipped out to North Africa in April 1943, they weren't rookies. They were among the most rigorously trained aviators in the world. Davis himself was the symbol of their struggle. The son of America's first black general, he had endured 4 long years of silence at West Point. No white cadet spoke to him outside official duties. Yet he faced it all with unbreakable dignity. Now he was leading his men into a war where the enemy in front of them might be less hostile than the allies beside them. Their arrival in Tunisia hit them hard. They were assigned to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William Momier, a man who saw the entire Tuskegee project as a waste of time and resources. He made his contempt clear, giving them worn-out second-hand P-40 Warhawks. They were tough planes, but already outdated, hopelessly outclassed by the German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. Then came the final insult. They were assigned to dull coastal patrols, routine sweeps far from the real fighting. It was a strategy meant to bury them quietly to ensure they never had a chance to prove themselves, so he could later report that the experiment had failed. Weeks passed in frustration. Morale sank. These men had trained to be warriors, yet they were being treated like children who couldn't be trusted, with sharp knives. But everything changed on July 2nd, 1943. While escorting B-25 bombers on a raid over a German airfield in Sicily, First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall spotted two Focke-Wulf 190s diving toward the bombers. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Hall broke formation, wrenching his P-40 into a sharp turn, cutting across the German fighter's path. He locked on target and squeezed the trigger. A stream of .50 caliber tracer rounds tore through the air, stitching across the enemy's fuselage. The Tuskegee Airmen had just scored their first kill. I fired a long burst, Hall later reported, and saw my tracers cut into the second aircraft. He tried to turn, but suddenly fell off and plunged straight into the ground. He had done it. A black American pilot, flying an inferior plane, had just shot down one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighters. When Hall landed back at base, the news spread like wildfire. The black ground crews, the mechanics, armorers, and technicians who had endured the same daily insults, erupted in celebration. They lifted Hall onto their shoulders and carried him around the airfield like a hero. They finally had proof. A victory no one could deny, no matter how much they tried. That afternoon, a single swastika was painted on the side of Hall's P-40 Warhawk. It was the first of 112 enemy kills that would eventually be credited to the Tuskegee Airmen. The first crack had appeared in the wall of prejudice. But one victory wasn't enough to silence the doubters. Colonel Momyer continued to send in negative reports, culminating in a devastating assessment that claimed the 99th Fighter Squadron lacked aggressiveness, that they were timid in combat. He officially recommended that they be removed from frontline duty and reassigned to coastal patrol permanently. To him, the experiment had failed. His report landed on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the entire Army Air Forces. Suddenly, the future of the entire Tuskegee program was hanging by a thread. All the training, all the sacrifice, even Charles Hall's historic victory, everything was about to be erased with the stroke of a pen, based on one prejudiced man's lies. Then, fate intervened on a bloody stretch of coastline called Anzio. In January 1944, Allied forces were barely holding a fragile beachhead in Italy. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything it had at them, massive, relentless waves of air attacks. It was chaos. On January 27th, the call went out. Every available fighter to the air. The 99th was scrambled. 15 Tuskegee pilots in their outdated P-40s climbed into a sky swarming with superior German Focke-Wulf 190s. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and underestimated, according to Momyer's logic. They should have run, but they didn't. They fought back with ferocity that stunned everyone watching. For 2 brutal days above the beaches of Anzio, the men once called timid shot down 12 German fighters. Lieutenant Charles Hall got 2 more kills, raising his total to 3. Captain Lemuel Custis downed another. Pilot after pilot scored victories. In just 48 hours, they destroyed more enemy aircraft than in their previous 7 months of combat combined. The performance was so extraordinary, so completely at odds with Momyer's reports, that the War Department couldn't ignore. And a full investigation was launched, comparing the 99th's record with other P-40 squadrons in the theater. The conclusion was undeniable. When you considered the inferior planes and missions they'd been given, the 99th was performing just as well, if not better, than their white counterparts. The so-called experiment was over. Anzio had saved them. They had proven beyond all doubt they could fight. But now they were about to prove something even greater. They could protect. In May 1944, a new chapter began. The 99th was merged with 3 other Tuskegee-trained squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, to form the legendary 392nd Fighter Group. Transferred to the 15th Air Force in Italy, they were given one of the most dangerous missions in the war: long-range bomber escort. Their task was to fly hundreds of miles into the heart of Nazi Germany, guarding vast formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24, liberators on bombing runs, and bringing them home alive. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. gathered his men at their new base in Ramitelli. He knew this was their ultimate test. He laid down one unbreakable rule that would define them forever. "Our job is not to be aces," he told them. "Forget chasing enemy fighters for personal glory. Our mission is to bring those bombers home. We stay with them, no matter what." It was a radical doctrine, one that would soon make the Red Tails legendary. Most American fighter groups followed an aggressive doctrine. Pilots were encouraged to roam, to hunt, to chase kills and rack up personal victories. But Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. believed in something different. He demanded discipline over glory. To him, success wasn't measured by the number of swastikas painted on their planes. It was measured by how many bomber crews made it home alive. Around this time, the 15th Air Force issued an order for all fighter groups to mark their aircraft with distinctive colors, so they could be easily identified amidst the chaos of combat. The 302nd Fighter Group was assigned the color red, and they didn't just paint a stripe on the wing. They went all in. The entire tail section of their brand new P-51 Mustangs gleamed with a brilliant, unmistakable crimson red, with matching red nosebands and propeller spinners. These planes were impossible to miss, a flash of fire cutting through the cold European skies. And so, the legend of the Red Tails was born. At first, the white bomber crews didn't know who their new escorts were. They didn't know these pilots were black. All they knew was that something felt different. These red-tailed fighters didn't dart off chasing German planes at the first sight of action. They stayed close, weaving a protective wall of steel and courage around the slow, vulnerable bombers. They were like guardian angels. If a bomber was hit and began to fall out of formation, a sitting duck for enemy fighters, a pair of red tails would peel off and stick with it, fighting off attackers all the way back home. Word spread quickly through the bomber bases in Italy. Crews started calling them the Red Tail Angels. In briefing rooms before missions, one question echoed again and again: "Who's our escort today?" And when the answer came, the 392nd, a wave of relief would wash over the room. Soon, bomber groups were specifically requesting the Red Tails for the toughest, most dangerous missions. The men once deemed unfit for combat had become the most trusted protectors in the sky. Their iron discipline, born from brutal training at Tuskegee and forged under Colonel Davis's steady command, was saving American lives every single day. The results spoke for themselves. On average, other P-51 escort groups lost 46 bombers under their watch. The Red Tails, only 27. But their greatest challenge, the mission that would define their legacy forever, was still to come. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former power. But Germany still had one final weapon, a terrifying new machine that looked like something from the future. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was unlike anything the Allies had faced. Faster, deadlier, untouchable. It could hit 540 miles per hour, a full 100 mph faster than the Mustang. It was a silver predator that could appear, strike, and vanish before most pilots even realized they were under attack. Defeating it seemed impossible. Then came March 24, 1945. The 302nd Fighter Group was given the most dangerous mission of their career, escorting B-17 bombers on a 6-mile round trip to Berlin, targeting the Daimler-Benz tank factory. It was the longest, deepest mission they had ever flown, straight into the hornet's nest. And intelligence reports confirmed their worst fears. The skies over Berlin were defended by Jagdgeschwader 7, an elite Luftwaffe unit flying the dreaded Me-262 jets. Colonel Davis led the mission himself. As the 43 Mustangs approached Berlin, the jets appeared, the largest formation of German jets ever assembled for a single battle. They tore through the sky like lightning, their turbine engines screaming. But the Red Tails were ready. They had studied the Me-262's weaknesses. It was faster, but it couldn't turn sharply, and its acceleration lagged when coming out of dives. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown remembered their tactic clearly. "We knew the German jets were faster. Instead of chasing them head-on, we'd turn away and then cut into their blind spots." It was a brilliant strategy. As a jet swooped in for the kill, Brown and his wingmen turned not toward it, but away, forcing the German pilot to overshoot. Then, as the jet streaked past, they snapped their Mustangs around and locked onto its tail. Brown opened fire. I pulled up at him in a 15-degree climb and fired 3 long bursts. He later reported. The jet burst into flames. The pilot bailed out, 1 down. That same day, Lieutenant Earl Lane did the impossible, hitting an Me-262 from over half a mile away with a perfect deflection shot. Moments later, Lieutenant Charles Brantley scored a 3rd. In a single afternoon, the Red Tails had shot down 3 of Hitler's superweapons, more jets than most American fighter groups destroyed in the entire war. For their extraordinary courage and unmatched performance, the 302nd Fighter Group was awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation, one of the military's highest honors. They had faced the future of aerial combat and defeated it. The mockery from the Luftwaffe, if it ever existed, was long gone. In its place was a quiet, grudging respect, earned through skill, courage, and the unbreakable discipline of the men once told they would never belong. They reportedly had a name for them. Schwarze meaning the Blackbird Men, but not every pilot's war ended in triumph. 32 Tuskegee Airmen were shot down and became prisoners of war. Their experiences revealed the strange and bitter ironies of that conflict. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson's P-51 Mustang was hit by flak over southern France in August 1944. When he was captured and taken in for interrogation, he was stunned by what the German officer already knew. The interrogator had detailed information about Ramitelli Airfield, our squadron commanders, even personal facts about my parents back home in Detroit, Jefferson later recalled. He knew my father was a teacher and even my mother's maiden name. Their intelligence was frighteningly thorough. The Germans knew exactly who he was, where he came from, and even the secret of the so-called experiment. Jefferson was later sent to Stalag Luft III, the same prison camp made famous by the movie The Great Escape. And it was there that the full absurdity of his situation truly hit him. Inside a Nazi prison camp, Jefferson found a level of racial equality he had never experienced in America. Many of the white American POWs, bomber crewmen who had once doubted men like him, now approached him with gratitude. They would shake my hand and thank me for the red tail protection that had kept them alive for so long, Jefferson said. Here I was, in a Nazi POW camp, being treated more equally by white Americans than I ever was back home. When the war finally ended and Jefferson was liberated, the first thing that happened when he set foot back on American soil was segregation. He had fought for his country, nearly died for it, and been honored as an equal by fellow Americans inside a German prison, only to return home to the same cruel prejudice he had left behind. He had helped win the war against fascism. But the war against racism was far from over. When the final record was tallied, the Tuskegee Airmen's numbers told their own story. Over 15,000 sorties flown, 178 combat missions, 112. Enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, 150 more destroyed on the ground. Even a German destroyer sunk with machine gun fire. 96 pilots awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Their bomber protection record was unmatched. But their greatest victory wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in the change they forced upon a nation that had doubted them. They proved, once and for all, that the color of a pilot's skin had nothing to do with his courage, skill, or ability to fly and fight. Their combat record became more than a mark of courage. It became a weapon for justice. After the war, civil rights activists used their achievements as undeniable proof that equality in the military was possible, and it became one of the key reasons why, in 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The men who had once been dismissed as an experiment had become the architects of a revolution. But recognition came slowly, painfully slowly. For decades, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen was largely forgotten by mainstream America. Their names faded into history books that few bothered to read. It wasn't until 2007 that justice, long overdue, finally arrived. That year, the Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor. By then, only about 300 of the original pilots were still alive to receive it. But their legacy had already been written, not in ink, but in the contrails of their Mustangs streaking across the skies of Berlin, in the grateful hearts of the bomber crews they had protected, and in the soul of a nation that they helped transform forever. As Roscoe Brown, the pilot who once shot down a German jet over Berlin, later said, "We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought ignorance, prejudice, and hatred, and we won all three battles. They had been set up to fail, expected to fail, and yet they achieved the one thing their doubters never believed possible. They soared."